Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I want you to close your eyes for just a second, or maybe just dim the lights and get comfortable, because this is going to be a deep one. I want you to imagine the modern world, right now, today. Think about the most powerful cities on Earth: New York, London, Tokyo. Imagine the global supply chain, the internet, the interconnectedness of trade and diplomacy, the constant flow of information and goods that keeps 7 billion people fed and clothed. Now, imagine all of it stops. Not slowly, not over a century of decline, but suddenly. Imagine the capital cities burning, the trade routes going silent, the writing systems forgotten, the knowledge of engineering and architecture completely erased from the collective memory within a single generation. That sounds like the plot of a dystopian sci-fi movie, doesn't it? But this isn't fiction. This actually happened. We are talking about the most profound, most mysterious system collapse in human history. The catastrophic end of the Late Bronze Age. This was the world's first true international era, a golden age that spanned the entire Mediterranean and Near East. And then, around the year 1200 BCE, it simply vanished. It was, quite literally, the silent collapse. In the space of just 50 years, the greatest, most sophisticated civilizations on the planet, the Mycenaean Greeks, the mighty Hittite Empire, the thriving kingdoms of the Levant, and the powerful new kingdom of Egypt, were crippled, destroyed, or forced into a debilitating retreat. When the smoke cleared, the world had entered a dark age so profound that historians call it the Homeric Gap, a period where literacy died, art stagnated, and the very memory of the previous prosperity was lost for centuries. How does an entire globalized world vanish overnight? That's the question that drives this entire documentary. And trust me, the answers are terrifyingly relevant to our own time. But before we dive into the dust and the ghosts of the past, I need to ask you, my incredible community, for a quick favor. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's greatest mysteries, please take a moment right now and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good historical riddle, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, activate the bell button for notifications for our new videos, because we have so much more history coming your way. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. And speaking of engagement, as we explore these competing theories, drought, revolt, and invasion, I want you to tell me in the comments below, which single factor do you find the most terrifyingly effective at bringing down a complex society? Climate change, internal revolution, or external invasion? Let me know your thoughts down there, and we can discuss them. Now let's set the stage. To understand the magnitude of the collapse, we first have to appreciate the scale of the world that was lost. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 BCE to 1200 BCE, was not a fragmented collection of tribes. It was a sophisticated, highly centralized, and shockingly globalized system. Think of it as the world's first true international order. At the heart of this system were the superpowers, communicating with each other not through modern English or Spanish, but through the diplomatic language of the era, Akkadian, written in cuneiform script. The kings of Egypt, the kings of Hatti, the Hittites, and the kings of Babylon addressed each other as brother in diplomatic letters, exchanging lavish gifts and forging military alliances. This wasn't just trade. This was a deep political and economic integration that stretched from modern-day Iran all the way to Sicily. Let's look at the key players who formed this magnificent edifice. In the Aegean, we had the Mycenaeans. These were the people of Homeric legend, the heroes who supposedly launched 1,000 ships against Troy. Their civilization was defined by magnificent, heavily fortified palace complexes, Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, ruled by powerful kings, or wanaxes. Their wealth was staggering, evidenced by the staggering gold retrieved from their shaft graves. They controlled vast maritime trade networks, exporting olive oil, wine, and high-quality pottery. And they managed their complex palace economies using a sophisticated administrative script called Linear B. They were the masters of the sea, the thalassocracy of the Aegean. To the east, in Anatolia, modern Turkey, stood the mighty Hittite Empire, or Hatti. For centuries, they were the only true military rival capable of standing toe-to-toe with Egypt. Their capital, Hattusa, was a sprawling city protected by massive cyclopean walls. They were famed for their mastery of chariot warfare and were the first to truly harness the power of iron, though the widespread use of iron tools was still nascent. The Hittite king was the absolute ruler of a vast territory, governing through a complex feudal system, controlling vital land routes and mineral resources. And then there was the undisputed heavyweight champion of stability and wealth, the new kingdom of Egypt. Under pharaohs like Ramses II and later Ramses III, Egypt was the ultimate provider of gold, grain, and stability. They controlled Nubia to the south and maintained significant influence over the city-states of the Levant. While they often clashed with the Hittites, culminating in the famous Battle of Kadesh, they eventually signed the world's first recorded peace treaty, cementing an era of détente and shared regional dominance. This wasn't just a handful of powerful states, it was a global ecosystem. We know this because of archaeological marvels like the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey. This single wreck, dating to around 1300 BCE, was carrying goods from at least 7 different cultures. Copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan or Central Asia, essential for making bronze, ebony from Egypt, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, and Mycenaean pottery. This wasn't a local boat. It was a floating microcosm of the globalized Bronze Age economy. Furthermore, The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt, reveal the intimate, often petty, squabbles and alliances between these great kings. The pharaoh demanding gold from the king of Babylon, the king of Mitanni complaining about the quality of the diplomatic gifts. This was a world of bureaucracy, international law, and incredible wealth redistribution, all focused around the massive palace complexes. But this very complexity, this dependence on a vast network of trade and diplomacy, was also its greatest weakness. The system was a beautiful, terrifyingly fragile house of cards. Imagine the palace at Pylos in Mycenaean Greece. It wasn't just a home for the king, it was the entire economic engine. Farmers brought their grain and livestock to the palace storerooms, and in return, the palace redistributed goods, manufactured tools, and organized specialized labor, all meticulously recorded on those linear B clay tablets. If the flow of grain or, crucially, the flow of imported tin or copper stopped, the entire social contract collapsed. The system was too top-heavy, too centralized, and utterly dependent on peace and predictable trade. And then, the music stopped. The year is approximately 1200 BCE. We don't have a single clean narrative of collapse. We have 1,000 fragmented screams from the archaeological record. In Anatolia, the mighty capital of Hattusa was utterly destroyed. Excavations show catastrophic burning, followed by immediate abandonment. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, simply ceased to exist as a unified political entity. Its records, its vast archives of cuneiform tablets, were silenced, buried beneath the rubble of the great king's citadel. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean world imploded. Almost every major palace center, Mycenae, Kyrens, Media, Thebes, and most dramatically, Pylos, suffered massive destruction by fire and was abandoned. The highly centralized administrative system vanished. The linear B script, which had recorded every sheep, every jar of oil, every transaction, suddenly stopped being written. Literacy disappeared from Greece for the next 400 years. The people who survived abandoned the plains and retreated to small, isolated hill settlements, living in impoverished conditions. In the Levant, cities like Ugarit and Kadesh were utterly wiped off the map. We have chilling evidence from Ugarit, a key trading port, in the form of the final cuneiform tablets. Desperate letters sent by the last king, pleading for help just hours before the city was overwhelmed. One letter describes enemy ships approaching. "Our land is dying," the scribe wrote. "The enemy's ships are burning the land." The great interconnected web snapped. Tin stopped reaching Cyprus, meaning bronze production ground to a halt. When you can't make bronze tools or weapons, your economy and military capabilities regress instantly. The sophisticated system of international diplomacy ceased. For 4 centuries, the great powers would not speak to each other. So what happened?
Was it one disaster, or was it a catastrophic domino effect? Historians and archaeologists have spent the last century piecing together the evidence, and generally, the theories fall into three major interconnected categories: climate change and famine, internal revolt and system failure, and the external pressure of the mysterious sea peoples. Let's start with the crushing weight of nature, the great drought and famine.
This theory suggests that the foundation of the collapse wasn't human warfare, but environmental catastrophe. The late Bronze Age world was dependent on consistent rainfall and predictable agricultural output. Studies of ancient pollen records and core samples taken from the Mediterranean sea floor and lakes, combined with analysis of tree rings, point to a prolonged, devastating period of aridification, a megadrought, that began around 1250 BCE and peaked right around 1200 BCE. This wasn't just a bad summer. This was multi-decade, systemic drought that affected the entire region simultaneously. Imagine the implications. If the rains fail in Anatolia, the Hittite heartland starves. If the rains fail in the Aegean, the Mycenaean palace system, built on the redistribution of surplus grain, instantly fractures. We see evidence of this environmental stress in the historical records that did survive. The Hittite records, before they vanished, speak of widespread famine and desperate pleas for grain from Pharaoh Merneptah of Egypt, who explicitly sent shipments of grain to Hatti to prevent starvation. Even Egypt, the breadbasket of the ancient world, was struggling. The Nile flooding became unpredictable, and the population, already massive, was put under intense pressure. When people are starving, they don't stay put. They move. They become refugees, migrants, or, worst of all, for the established order, raiders. The drought didn't just kill crops. It mobilized populations, turning once stable farmers into desperate, armed groups seeking new land and resources. This environmental pressure acted as the ultimate catalyst, destabilizing every major power simultaneously. This leads us directly to the second major theory: the system collapse and internal revolution. The Bronze Age palace economies were magnificent, but inherently brittle. They hoarded the wealth, controlled the means of production, like the bronze necessary for tools, and demanded allegiance in exchange for security and resources. As long as the trade routes were open and the harvests were good, the system worked. But what happens when the drought hits, the ships stop sailing, and the palace cannot deliver the promised security, or more critically, the food? The common folk, the farmers and laborers who supported the entire structure, would logically turn against the centralized authority that was failing them. The destruction of the Mycenaean palaces, in particular, often shows signs of internal revolt, rather than just external invasion. Why? Because the palaces were not just looted, they were systematically destroyed, and often abandoned without any attempt at immediate rebuilding. This suggests a deep internal rejection of the Wanaks and the centralized power structure. Historian Robert Drews suggested that the nature of warfare itself changed. The Mycenaean and Hittite armies relied heavily on expensive, elite chariot warfare. But during this period, we see the rise of cheaper, more effective infantry armed with javelins and early iron weapons. If the common foot soldier could defeat the elite chariot warrior, the entire aristocratic military hierarchy was overturned. The people didn't just revolt, they had the means to win. The internal collapse theory suggests the civilization choked on its own complexity. The system was so specialized and interconnected that when one piece failed, the tin supply, the grain harvest, the diplomatic channel, the entire edifice came down in a self-inflicted, devastating chain reaction. The palaces burned not because of one enemy, but because the people who served them decided they had nothing left to lose. For historians, the Sea Peoples are the ultimate boogeymen of the Bronze Age, a collective term used primarily by the Egyptians to describe waves of foreign invaders who attacked the coasts of Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and ultimately Egypt itself. They were a mysterious, relentless force, and their existence is the most compelling evidence for a massive external pressure contributing to the collapse. Our primary source for the Sea Peoples comes from the monumental mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu in Upper Egypt. On the walls, Ramses III commissioned stunning, detailed reliefs showing his great victory over these invaders in 1177 BCE. The inscriptions describe them not just as enemies, but as a coalition of disparate groups, including the Peliset, who many scholars believe became the Philistines, the Teker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, perhaps related to the Danaans of Greek myth, and the terrifying Sheridan, often depicted wearing horned helmets. These reliefs show entire families, men, women, and children, traveling in ox carts, suggesting they were not just raiders, but entire populations seeking new homelands, driven perhaps by the very droughts and famines we discussed earlier. They traveled by land and sea, overwhelming city after city. The Egyptian inscriptions are chilling. They state that no land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia, being cut off at one time. This single sentence confirms that the collapse was regional and simultaneous. The Sea Peoples had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and the kingdoms of the Levant before they reached the borders of Egypt. Ramses III managed to defeat them, both in a massive land battle and a decisive naval engagement in the Nile Delta. His victory is often credited with saving Egypt from the fate of its northern neighbors. However, the victory came at an enormous cost. Egypt was severely weakened, economically and militarily exhausted, and forced to retreat from its imperial holdings in the Levant.
While the Sea Peoples didn't conquer Egypt, they effectively ended its dominance, ushering in centuries of decline and fragmentation. The Sea Peoples were not a unified empire. They were likely a consequence of the collapse rather than the sole cause. They were the desperate, displaced populations, perhaps Mycenaean refugees, Italian tribes, or Anatolian migrants, who were forced onto the sea by famine and internal strife, becoming raiders and colonizers out of sheer necessity.
They were the human wave created by the breaking system. What we are left with is a narrative of convergence. The Late Bronze Age didn't collapse because of a single arrow. It collapsed because three major forces: climate change, internal economic failure, and mass migration.
Invasion converged at the exact same moment in history.
The result was a profound, multi-generational catastrophe. The sophisticated world of palaces and international trade was replaced by small, isolated villages. Monumental architecture ceased. The ability to write was lost. The knowledge of bronze working, an incredibly complex skill requiring precise metallurgy and international trade routes for tin and copper, was replaced by an inefficient early phase of ironworking. It took 400 years, the entire duration of the Greek Dark Age, for the Mediterranean world to begin to rebuild. When it finally emerged in the 8th century BCE, the world was fundamentally different. Gone were the centralized palaces. In their place rose the decentralized city-states, the polis. The memory of the Bronze Age superpowers was so faded that they survived only as mythological echoes in the poetry of Homer. The true lesson of the silent collapse isn't just that civilizations fall, but that complexity breeds vulnerability. When a system becomes too centralized, too dependent on external stability, and too specialized, a single point of failure can trigger a cascade that proves fatal. It's a stark, chilling warning from the dust of 1200 BCE, echoing across 3 millennia, right into our modern, equally interconnected world. That they survived only as mythological echoes in the poetry of Homer. The true lesson of the silent collapse isn't just that civilizations fall, but that complexity breeds vulnerability. When a system becomes too centralized, too dependent on external stability, and too specialized, a single point of failure can trigger a cascade that proves fatal. It's a stark, chilling warning from the dust of 1200 BCE, echoing across 3 millennia, right into our modern, equally interconnected world. Right? So let's zoom in on that single point of failure. If complexity was the disease, the immediate trigger, the fatal infection, was almost certainly environmental. We're talking about a catastrophic, multi-generational drought. Guys, this wasn't just a bad summer. Paleoclimatologists, using things like tree rings, sediment cores from lakes, and even pollen analysis, have painted a terrifying picture. A sustained shift in weather patterns across the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East, starting right around 1250 BCE and hitting critical mass by 1200 BCE. Imagine the breadbasket of the ancient world. Regions like Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Nile Delta, suddenly suffering year after year of inadequate rainfall.
The Hittite Empire, which relied heavily on Anatolian grain, was already sending desperate letters to Egyptian pharaohs, begging for emergency shipments of food decades before their capital, Hattusa, was burned. Think about that. The most powerful empire in Western Asia, reduced to pleading for charity. The interconnectedness that had made them rich now made them mutually dependent in failure.
The moment the farms failed, the palaces, which were essentially giant centralized food banks, couldn't feed the masses. This isn't just about starvation, it's about the social contract dissolving. When the king can't guarantee the harvest, why follow the king?
Hey, if you're finding this deep dive into ancient apocalypse fascinating, do me a favor and smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that history is awesome and helps us reach more history buffs just like you. This environmental catastrophe wasn't operating in a vacuum.
It immediately shattered the second pillar of their complexity, the globalized trade network. And when I say globalized, I mean it. These were sophisticated logistics chains stretching thousands of miles. Copper was relatively plentiful. Cyprus was the main hub. But tin? Tin was the oil of the Bronze Age. It was rare, expensive, and often traveled through multiple hostile territories to reach the Aegean or Anatolia. When the political stability needed to police these trade routes evaporated, because local rulers were too busy dealing with starving peasants or fighting for water rights, the tin supply dried up instantly. No tin, no bronze. No bronze, no new weapons, no tools, no repair of the chariots that defined military dominance. The warrior class, the foundation of Mycenaean and Hittite power, suddenly found its currency and its means of survival vanishing. Imagine the panic. A Mycenaean general, trained since birth in chariot warfare, discovering he can't replace his bronze spearhead because the tin caravan from the east hasn't shown up for 6 months. This wasn't a slow economic decline. It was an acute, instant metal famine. And what happens when a highly militarized society runs out of the means to make weapons? They turn on each other, or they look for easy targets. And this brings us, inevitably, to the boogeymen of the Bronze Age collapse, the Sea Peoples. Look, we see their names carved into the stone temples of Ramesses III in Egypt. The Peliset, the Sheridan, the Luca, the Shekelesh. They are depicted as a terrifying, relentless horde arriving by land and sea, sacking cities from Ubarit to Hattusa. But here's the crucial twist, guys. And this is where modern archaeology gets really fascinating. Were the Sea Peoples the cause of the collapse, or were they the symptom? Many archaeologists now lean toward the latter. Think of them less as a unified conquering army and more as a massive, desperate refugee crisis, armed to the teeth. They were the displaced populations, perhaps Mycenaean mercenaries who had lost their pay, Anatolian farmers fleeing drought, or Aegean islanders whose trade routes had been destroyed. They weren't invading to conquer and rule. They were invading to eat and survive. They were the ultimate expression of the system turning cannibalistic. The Egyptian records themselves hint at this complexity. Ramesses III doesn't just mention fighting the sea peoples. He mentions that they arrived with their families, their ox carts, and their possessions. This wasn't a military campaign. It was a migration of desperation. When they hit the already weakened, famine-stricken palaces of the Levant, the effect was devastating. The centralized structure, designed to manage wealth, was utterly defenseless against decentralized, mobile bands of survivors with nothing left to lose. Tell me in the comments right now, do you think the Sea Peoples were the original Viking-style raiders? Or do you think they were history's first major climate change refugees? I read every single comment, guys. Let me know your theories. We can't talk about the collapse without talking about the people who actually grew the food and built the walls, the peasants. For centuries, the massive Mycenaean and Hittite palaces operated on a highly extractive model. The palace elite lived in luxury, supported by the forced labor and taxation of the surrounding populace. This works fine when the palace delivers stability, protection, and successful harvests. But when the drought hit, when the tin stopped flowing, and when the king couldn't even guarantee water, that social pyramid became inverted. The elite became burdens, not protectors. Archaeology shows a fascinating pattern of destruction in many sites, particularly in the Mycenaean heartland. It's not always a neat, external burn layer. Sometimes the destruction seems targeted. The centralized storage rooms, the archives, the symbols of royal authority, while the smaller, peripheral settlements are left untouched. This suggests that in many places, the collapse was accelerated, if not initiated, by internal uprisings. The people simply took the opportunity presented by the chaos to dismantle the system that had oppressed them for generations. This is the silent collapse at its most profound. Not the sound of war trumpets, but the sound of the masses rejecting the old order. They didn't necessarily replace the king with a new government. They simply stopped participating in the system. They retreated into smaller, self-sufficient, decentralized communities. They walked away from the massive, vulnerable palaces and went back to basics. The immediate aftermath was brutal. This period, known as the Greek Dark Age, lasted for nearly 400 years. Imagine losing 400 years of progress overnight. The sophisticated linear B script, used by the Mycenaeans to manage their massive bureaucracies, vanished. Poof. Literacy essentially disappeared from the Aegean world. The art of monumental stonework, the construction of those cyclopean walls we marvel at today, forgotten. The diplomatic language of the age, Akkadian cuneiform, which allowed kings from Egypt to Babylon to communicate seamlessly, became obsolete in the Aegean. The survivors, those small, scattered communities, had to strip down their lives to the absolute essentials. They lost the ability to manage complex logistics, but they gained resilience. They were forced to adapt, and this adaptation brought about the Iron Age. Bronze was dependent on global trade for tin. Iron ore was everywhere. Iron was initially a vastly inferior metal. It rusted. It was harder to work. But it was local. It was accessible. The collapse forced a technological downgrade that ultimately made society more robust, less dependent on a complex international supply chain. This shift from Bronze Age palaces to Iron Age villages is the ultimate metaphor for the collapse. They traded luxury and high technology for survival and self-sufficiency. They learned the hard way that sometimes simplification is the key to enduring extinction-level events. If you want to see more videos about lost civilizations and the mysteries of the past, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. You don't want to miss our next deep dive. Now, let's bring this terrifying history lesson back to our time. We started by saying the silent collapse is a warning for the modern world. Look around. Are we less complex? No. Are we less specialized? Absolutely not. We are hyper-specialized and hyper-centralized, but instead of tin, our critical vulnerabilities are microchips, rare earth minerals, and oil. Think about the COVID-19 pandemic and the immediate, crippling effect it had on global supply chains. A single factory closure in Asia could halt car production in Europe or empty shelves in America. That's a Bronze Age level of fragility, just scaled up by a factor of 10,000. Our just-in-time inventory systems are the modern equivalent of the palace storage rooms, highly efficient when things are perfect, but catastrophically fragile when the system hits a single point of failure. And what about climate change? We are facing environmental stressors far greater than the multi-year drought of 1200 BCE. But our agricultural systems are still highly dependent on predictable weather patterns and cheap energy inputs. If the major grain-producing regions of the world, the American Midwest, Ukraine, India, suffer concurrent, sustained failures due to drought or extreme weather, the cascade effect on global political stability would be immediate and severe. We would see the modern equivalent of the Sea Peoples, massive, armed migrations of climate refugees destabilizing border regions. The lesson isn't that we will collapse, but that the mechanism of collapse remains the same. Interconnectedness magnifies failure. The more links in the chain, the easier it is to snap. Let's zero in on one specific location that perfectly encapsulates the horror: the great city of Ugarit on the coast of modern Syria. Ugarit was the shining jewel of the international trading system. It was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and literate, sitting at the nexus of the Cypriot copper trade and the overland routes. We know exactly how Ugarit died because archaeologists found the mailbox. Not literally, of course, but the administrative archives. Clay tablets baked hard by the very fires that consumed the city. These aren't historical summaries written decades later. These are real-time distress calls. Imagine getting a text message from an entire civilization as it's being wiped off the map. That's what we have here, preserved in the ruins of Ugarit. The tablets paint a picture of utter mounting panic. The correspondence between King Amurapi of Ugarit and his neighbors and overlords shows a system buckling under pressure. One of the most chilling exchanges is between Amurapi and the king of Alashia, the ancient name for Cyprus. Amurapi is begging for help, writing about enemy ships appearing off the coast, a clear and immediate threat. He writes, and I paraphrase here, "My father, behold, the enemy ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are stationed in the land of Hatti, the Hittite Empire, and all my ships are stationed in the land of Luca? The country is abandoned to itself." Think about that for a second. This is the ultimate tragic display of misplaced loyalty and systemic overcommitment. Ugarit was so deeply entwined in the Bronze Age collective security agreement that its own defense forces were deployed hundreds of miles away, fighting other people's battles, likely against rebels or those internal threats we discussed earlier. When the actual existential threat arrived on his doorstep, a maritime invasion, King Amurapi was left with an empty armory and an exposed coastline. He sacrificed local resilience for collective security, and when the collective failed, he was the first to fall. It's a devastating lesson in strategic priorities. But the correspondence from Alashia is equally telling. The Cypriot king basically writes back, "Dude, I hear you, but honestly, I'm dealing with my own problems." The same ships that attacked you are attacking me. We're all in this mess together, and I can't spare anyone. The system wasn't just breaking. The system was actively refusing to help its own members. The sophisticated network of treaties, obligations, and mutual defense agreements, the very foundation of the late Bronze Age political architecture, dissolved instantly when the actual crisis hit. The last tablet ever recorded in Ugarit is an administrative list, followed by a layer of ash and rubble. The record just stops. There is no glorious final battle narrative, no detailed chronicle of defeat, just silence. The city was burned so fiercely that the clay tablets were fired into permanence, preserving the evidence of their demise for us to read 3 millennia later. The destruction layer is universal across the city, suggesting not just a raid, but a total, deliberate annihilation. Now, who were these terrifying maritime invaders? This brings us to the primary suspects in the Bronze Age murder mystery: the Sea Peoples. These guys are the boogeymen of the late 2nd millennium BCE. They appear in Egyptian hieroglyphic records, most famously on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple commissioned by Pharaoh Ramesses III. The Egyptians, who were one of the few powers that managed to survive the collapse, though severely weakened, depict these invaders in vivid, terrifying detail. They show massive naval battles, land armies, and distinctive characteristics, feathered headdresses, round shields, and ships packed with warriors, women, and children, suggesting they weren't just pirates, but migrating populations. The names are legendary and confusing. The Peliset, widely believed to be the ancestors of the Philistines, the Teker, the Shekelesh, the Denyana. They are described as a terrifying coalition, moving like a wave, destroying Hatti, Kizuwatna, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia, all the great powers of the Near East, before being finally repelled, barely, by Ramesses III in the Nile Delta.
But here is the million-dollar question, guys. The one that still keeps archaeologists up at night. Where did they come from? We have zero definitive evidence of their homeland. Zero. Were they Mycenaean Greeks displaced by internal strife or drought? Were they Sardinians, the Sheridan? Were they simply a massive multi-ethnic coalition of desperate refugees, pirates, and opportunists, driven by the very famine and internal collapse they helped accelerate? This is where I want to hear from you. If you had to bet all your ancient copper ingots on one theory, where did the Sea Peoples originate? The Aegean.
Italy? The Balkans? Drop your best theories in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can, and sometimes your wild theories are closer to the truth than the academic consensus. And while you're scrolling down, take 2 seconds and smash that like button if you're finding this deep dive into ancient apocalypse fascinating. We're unraveling a mystery that silenced an entire epoch. The Sea Peoples were undoubtedly the catalyst for the final, violent collapse of cities like Ugarit. But we must remember, the invasion was the final, fatal blow. The patient was already gravely ill. The single greatest underlying factor that made the entire system vulnerable was climate change and chronic drought. We aren't talking about a brief dry spell. We are talking about a massive, sustained aridification event that engulfed the entire eastern Mediterranean and Near East, starting roughly between 1250 BCE and 1150 BCE. Scientists have pieced this together using incredible paleoclimate data, analyzing pollen pores from lake beds, sediment deposits in the Mediterranean, and even dendrochronology, tree ring dating from ancient wood samples.
The evidence is overwhelming. Decades of significantly reduced rainfall. In a region where agriculture was almost entirely rain-fed, decades of drought meant crop failures, year after year. Imagine the political instability this creates.
The palaces, the central authorities, were responsible for maintaining the massive redistribution networks. They collected grain, stored it, and distributed it to support the non-agricultural class, the scribes, the bronzesmiths, the priests, the chariot warriors. When the grain fails, the central authority cannot fulfill its social contract. The vast stores of the palace empty out. Famine takes hold. People stop trusting the king. They stop paying taxes. They revolt, or worse, they migrate. This environmental stress explains a lot of the chaos before the Sea Peoples arrived. It explains why the Hittite Empire was already struggling with internal rebellions, and why the Mycenaean centers in Greece were showing signs of decline and depopulation. The system wasn't just interconnected economically, it was interconnected ecologically. Drought in Anatolia meant famine in Syria, which meant trade routes were cut, which meant the Mycenaeans couldn't get tin or copper, which led to internal breakdown in Greece.
And speaking of the Hittite Empire, the great superpower of Anatolia, its demise is perhaps the most terrifying example of the collapse's totality. The Hittites controlled a vast territory stretching from central Anatolia down into Syria, rivaling Egypt for geopolitical dominance. Their capital, Hattusa, was a monumental city, protected by cyclopean walls and filled with immense archives written in their complex cuneiform script. Around 1200 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned and burned, not just raided, but systematically dismantled. Unlike Ugarit, which left us its final panicked letters, the Hittite records simply stop. The imperial archives, the thousands of clay tablets detailing treaties, laws, and religious rituals, were found scattered and unread. The key horror here is the loss of institutional memory. When the Hittite state collapsed, the knowledge of how to read and write the complex cuneiform script used for their official language, Luwian, essentially disappeared in Anatolia. It wasn't just a political collapse, it was a cognitive collapse. 1,000 years of history, legal tradition, and governmental bureaucracy vanished because the scribal class, who were supported by the palace, ceased to exist. Imagine if the internet and all libraries suddenly vanished, and the only people who knew how to read vanished with them. That is the scale of the intellectual catastrophe that followed the fall of Hattusa. What emerged from the ashes of the Hittite Empire were tiny, isolated, Neo-Hittite city-states in southern Turkey and Syria, often speaking different dialects and certainly lacking the centralized power and literacy of their imperial predecessors. The grand scale was gone. Everything was simplified, localized, and poorer. This simplification is the hallmark of the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces, massive, complex administrative centers like Pylos and Mycenae, were destroyed. The Mycenaeans, who had a relatively simple syllabic script called Linear B, completely lost the ability to write. Literacy vanishes from the Aegean world for nearly 400 years. 4 centuries of silence. When writing finally reappears in Greece, it's a completely new system, the Greek alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. The link to the past was severed. The Iron Age that dawned
was not a sudden technological leap forward. It was an adaptation to poverty. Bronze production requires a massive, complex, international supply chain. Tin from Afghanistan or Cornwall, copper from Cyprus. When the trading routes snapped, when the palaces that organized the mining and smelting disappeared, the supply of bronze dried up almost overnight. People didn't switch to iron because it was superior. Early iron was actually far inferior to good bronze. They switched because iron ore, hematite, is common and can be locally sourced and smelted in small, decentralized furnaces by individual communities. Iron was the poor man's metal. It was the metal of necessity when global trade had failed. So, when we look at the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, we are looking at a radical simplification across the board. 1. Political simplification. From large empires and centralized palace systems to small tribal chieftaincies or isolated city-states. Economic simplification. From global trade in luxury goods, tin, lapis lazuli, specialized pottery, to localized subsistence economies. 3. Technological simplification. From complex bronze metallurgy and centralized monumental architecture to simple ironworking and small domestic dwellings. 4. Cognitive simplification. The loss of writing, mathematics, and advanced astronomical knowledge. The entire Mediterranean basin hit the reset button, but that reset was violent, chaotic, and profoundly dark for the people who lived through it. But hold on, there is one major counter-argument to the idea that this was purely a climate disaster or an external invasion. Many historians argue that the system was already rotten from the inside out. This brings us back to the inherent fragility of that palace economy. Remember how the palaces controlled everything. They were the bankers, the manufacturers, the employers, and the military command structure. This created a massive, top-heavy bureaucracy. As the population grew and the climate stressed the agricultural base, the elite, the kings and the palace bureaucracy likely continued to demand the same high level of tribute and luxury goods, increasing the burden on the common farmers and laborers. We see archaeological evidence of increased fortification before the collapse, suggesting internal unrest was a growing problem. Perhaps the Sea Peoples weren't just invaders. Perhaps they were an external force that exploited existing internal class warfare and peasant revolts. Maybe when the Sea Peoples arrived at the gates of a city, the starving, overworked populace didn't rush to defend the palace that had oppressed them. Maybe they opened the gates. If you think the internal collapse theory holds more weight than the external invasion theory, tell me why in the comments. Do you think the Sea Peoples were just the cleanup crew for a system that had already failed its people? Let's get a discussion going. And seriously, if you want to keep exploring these mysteries with me, the lost civilizations, the dark ages, and the terrifying lessons they hold for us today, make sure you hit that notification bell right now. You don't want to miss what we uncover next. the mystery of the sea peoples and the systemic failure of the Bronze Age system is so compelling because it forces us to confront the terrifying reality of what happens when complexity becomes fragility. They built these incredible structures, these massive trade networks, these sophisticated diplomatic relationships, but they failed to build in redundancy. There was no plan B. When one crucial link failed, the entire chain snapped. And the collapse was not gradual, it was sudden. The evidence suggests that many cities were destroyed within a 50-year window, a blink of an eye in historical terms. For the people living in Ugarit or Hattusa, their world didn't gradually decline. It ended with fire, famine, and the silent, terrifying realization that the ships weren't coming to save them. And the silence that followed was deafening. The Mediterranean went from a bustling, interconnected highway of ships and ambassadors to a patchwork of isolated, suspicious villages. The memory of the Great Age faded into myth. The stories of the heroes of the Bronze Age, the great wars, and the magnificent palaces survived only as distorted oral tradition, eventually being written down centuries later in epics like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, tales of a golden age that was truly lost. But there's one more layer to this mystery, one that connects the environmental catastrophe directly to the social breakdown. The shift in the global climate patterns didn't just cause drought. It may have caused plagues. This could have easily added a massive death toll, further destabilizing the military and administrative structures that were already struggling to cope with the lack of food and the threat of invasion. We see this pattern throughout history. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it fundamentally reshaped the feudal economy because labor became scarce and expensive. A Bronze Age plague, coupled with drought and war, would have been the ultimate trifecta of doom, ensuring that even the cities that survived the initial attack could not sustain themselves afterward. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm, where multiple cascading failures converged simultaneously, proving that sometimes the most advanced systems are simply too brittle to survive a shock. We still have to explore how certain regions managed to partially escape the worst of the collapse, like Egypt, which survived by contracting its borders, or the rise of the Phoenicians, who would eventually redefine maritime trade. But for the vast majority of the great Bronze Age kings, the game was definitively over. Their world burned, and the silence that followed lasted for centuries. But hold up, history junkies, because while the lights went out for the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and the Cypriots, there were a few flickerings of resistance, a few places that managed to cling to the edges of the abyss and not fall completely into the void. We're talking about Egypt.
Now, Egypt didn't just shrug off the collapse. They were hammered, absolutely pulverized. If you look at the reign of Ramesses III, the last true powerful pharaoh of the New Kingdom, his records read like a desperate, bloody horror movie.
He faced the full brunt of the so-called sea peoples, those mysterious, relentless maritime raiders who were essentially the final, chaotic wave of the Bronze Age migration crisis. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, carved into the temple walls, are chilling. They show these massive, pitched land and sea battles. Ramesses III describes the invaders. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were scattered and broken up in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia, they were cut off at one time. Did you catch that? Ramesses III is literally listing the great kingdoms that had just been wiped off the map, and he's saying, they came for us next. Egypt survived, but only just. Why? Because unlike the complex, decentralized administrative systems of the Mycenaeans, or the overstretched trade network of the Hittites, Egypt had two key advantages: geographical isolation. The Nile Valley is naturally defensible, surrounded by deserts, and critically, a deeply entrenched, sacred concept of centralized kingship. When the sea peoples were repelled, and Ramesses III did repel them, in a decisive victory that cost Egypt dearly, the pharaoh remained the ultimate authority. The system didn't shatter. It contracted. But make no mistake, the victory was Pyrrhic. Egypt lost its foreign territories, its gold mines, its influence in the Levant, and its access to crucial resources like tin. It entered a long period of decline, internal division, and fragmentation. It survived the 12th century BCE, yes, but it spent the next 400 years as a shadow of its former superpower self. It was a civilization on life support, but crucially, the continuity of its writing, its religion, and its centralized state structure meant it never truly entered the Dark Age oblivion that swallowed its neighbors. Now pause for a second, because this is where the new world starts to emerge from the ashes. While the great palaces were smoldering ruins, a few scrappy coastal communities managed to not only survive, but thrive in the chaos. The people we call the Phoenicians. These guys, clustered in city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, were the ultimate pragmatists. They were never empire builders. They were middlemen. When the massive Mycenaean and Minoan trade fleets disappeared, and the Hittite overland routes choked on dust and bandits, the Phoenicians saw an opportunity. They were masters of shipbuilding and navigation, and they realized that in a world of disconnected, terrified pockets of survivors, the one thing everyone still needed was trade. They didn't just rebuild the trade routes, they redefined them. They sailed west, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, eventually founding Carthage in North Africa. They didn't conquer, they traded. They didn't enforce a unified cultural system, they adapted. And here's the biggest game changer they brought to the table.
the thing that allowed civilization to eventually climb back out of the literacy hole the collapse had dug. The alphabet.
Think about it. The Bronze Age empires used incredibly complex writing systems: Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hittite cuneiform, Mycenaean linear B. These required years of training, specialized scribes, and centralized palace administration. When the palaces burned, the scribal class vanished, and the writing systems died with them. The Phoenicians, being merchants, needed something fast, simple, and efficient to track inventory and deals. They developed a 22-letter consonantal alphabet derived from earlier Semitic scripts.
This was revolutionary. It was a writing system that anyone could learn relatively quickly. It democratized literacy.
It was the operating system upgrade that the Iron Age world desperately needed, and it's the direct ancestor of nearly every alphabet used today, including the one you're reading right now. Seriously, how cool is that? A catastrophic worldwide collapse forces a shift from complex, elite-controlled literacy to a simple, universal system designed by businessmen. It's the ultimate historical pivot point. Let me know in the comments. Do you think the Bronze Age would have survived if they had already adopted an alphabet instead of cuneiform? I want to hear your theories. But before we get too excited about the Phoenicians and their amazing alphabet, we have to acknowledge the grim reality that gripped the vast majority of the former civilized world for the next 300 to 400 years. This wasn't just a recession, it was a total societal reset, a period historians call the Greek Dark Age, or the Early Iron Age. When we say Dark Age, we don't just mean we lack records. We mean life fundamentally regressed. Imagine losing 90% of all technological advancement overnight. Let's look at the physical evidence in Greece, the heartland of the fallen Mycenaean Empire. The population plummeted. Some estimates suggest a drop of 75% or more. People abandoned the massive, fortified citadel cities like Mycenae and Tiryns. They didn't migrate to new cities. They scattered into tiny, isolated hamlets. The complex, hierarchical structure of the Wanaks, the Mycenaean king, and his bureaucracy vanished completely. Society reverted to tribal, kinship-based systems led by local chieftains or elders. And the technology loss? It was staggering. First, the architecture. The Mycenaeans built monumental stone structures, impressive cyclopean walls, and elaborate tholos tombs, those massive beehive tombs. After the collapse, construction reverted to simple mud brick and timber huts. They literally forgot how to cut and move massive stones. The ability to coordinate large-scale labor projects was lost because the centralized economy that funded them was gone. Second, the writing. As mentioned, linear B vanished entirely. For centuries, the people living in the ruins of Mycenae were illiterate.
Oral tradition replaced the written word. This loss of record-keeping meant the collapse was not just economic, it was a cultural amnesia. They forgot their own history, their own ancestry. Homer's epic poems, written centuries later, are the hazy, mythological memory of a world the Greeks could no longer truly comprehend. Third, and perhaps most tellingly for archaeologists, look at the pottery. In the Bronze Age, pottery was high quality, mass-produced, often painted with intricate geometric designs, indicative of specialized craft production and wide distribution. In the Dark Age, the pottery becomes crude, handmade, and locally sourced. The designs are simple, often sloppy. It's a physical manifestation of the loss of specialization and mass production. When you can't maintain a trade route for tin, you certainly can't maintain a professional pottery workshop. Everything shrunk. The world went from being a globalized network of interconnected palaces swapping luxury goods and resources across thousands of miles to isolated agrarian communities focused entirely on subsistence farming and local defense. This is the true terror of the silent collapse. It wasn't just the fall of kings. It was the erasure of knowledge and complexity. Now, how did they eventually claw their way back? The answer, ironically, lies in the very scarcity that defined the collapse. It's the story of iron. Remember what killed the Bronze Age? The tin shortage. Bronze is an alloy of copper, fairly common, and tin, extremely rare, requiring complex, long-distance trade routes, often stretching from Cornwall in Britain all the way to Afghanistan. When those trade routes collapsed, bronze production, the lifeblood of Bronze Age military and agriculture, seized up. Bronze became impossibly expensive, reserved only for ceremonial items or small, localized tool production. But necessity is the mother of invention, right? When the sophisticated metallurgy of the palace systems failed, people started looking around at what they had locally. What did they have? Iron ore. Iron is the fourth most common element in the Earth's crust. It's everywhere. You can find bog iron in swamps. You don't need a 1,000-mile trade route to get it. The problem: iron is much harder to work than bronze. It has a higher melting point, and the technology to smelt it effectively was initially crude. For centuries, the iron tools produced were brittle and inferior to quality bronze. This is why the Iron Age didn't start before the collapse. Bronze was simply better and easier to work with when the supply chain was functional. But once the Bronze Age supply chain was broken, the accessibility of iron became its killer advantage. The shift to iron metallurgy was a monumental, accidental revolution. Because iron ore was ubiquitous, the power to create tools and weapons moved away from the centralized palace control. Bronze was the metal of the elite. Iron became the metal of the common man. This democratization of technology fundamentally changed warfare, agriculture, and society. A farmer could now afford an iron plowshare, allowing him to work heavier soils and increase food production. A local blacksmith, not a palace workshop, could arm a local militia.
This gradual, painful adoption of iron, which starts around the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, is the first tiny spark of the revival. It was a technology born not of brilliance, but of desperation. This is a great time to hit that notification bell, guys, because what we're talking about next is going to blow your mind. The lingering psychological scars of the collapse. How do you rebuild a culture when the generation that remembers the good times is gone, and all you have are ruins and myths? Think about the psychological impact of living in the shadow of giants. The people of the Greek Dark Age lived literally surrounded by the ruins of the Mycenaean civilization. Massive, incomprehensible walls and tombs built by people who seemingly vanished overnight.
They didn't understand who built them. They looked at the cyclopean walls of Mycenae and thought, only giants, cyclopes, could have moved those stones. This is where the myth of the heroic, titanic past originates. The Dark Age Greeks saw their ancestors not as sophisticated traders and bureaucrats, but as demigods who wielded power they could only dream of. This created a deep cultural pessimism, a sense that the world had irreversibly declined from a golden age. This memory, however distorted, shaped their entire worldview when literacy finally returned.
It's why Greek literature is so obsessed with fate, decline, and the hubris of powerful men. They were living proof that civilization could be wiped out in a single generation. And this psychological scar wasn't unique to Greece.
In Anatolia, the Hittite language and cuneiform writing disappeared entirely, replaced eventually by various local dialects and scripts. The very memory of the mighty Hittite Empire, which had challenged Egypt for centuries, was buried under the sands, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists millennia later. The people living there simply forgot they existed. The vacuum left by the collapse was immense, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with localized power struggles, banditry, and a desperate struggle for survival. The term Sea Peoples likely refers not just to a single coordinated invasion force, but to a collective term for displaced refugees, pirates, and desperate former soldiers from all the fallen empires, now roaming the seas looking for food and resources. It was a massive, uncontrolled refugee crisis, spiraling into militarized anarchy. One of the most profound mysteries we still grapple with today is the sheer scale of the administrative breakdown. We're not just talking about a king dying. We're talking about the complete failure of logistics. Consider the complexity of the palace economies. In Mycenaean Greece, the palace was everything: the central bank, the armory, the granary, the tax office, and the manufacturing hub. Thousands of clay tablets recorded every sheep, every jar of oil, every piece of bronze issued. This level of bureaucratic control was impressive,
But it was also incredibly fragile. When the palace at Pylos burned, the clay tablets were baked hard, preserving the final moments of the administration. They show meticulous planning right up until the point of disaster, records detailing troop movements, naval preparations, and offerings to the gods for protection.
There is no record of a slow decline, no memo saying, "We are running out of tin next month." It was sudden, catastrophic, and total. It's like the administrative system had no redundancy.
It was a single point of failure. When the central authority was removed, whether by internal revolt, earthquake, or invasion, the entire economic structure dissolved instantly. There was no local backup, no decentralized market economy to take over.
The complex web of specialization collapsed back into basic, generalized subsistence living. If you're finding this deep dive fascinating, please share this video with your friends who love history and archaeology, because we are getting into some seriously overlooked details here. Let's talk briefly about a fascinating micro-mystery within the collapse, the fate of Ugarit. Ugarit, located on the coast of modern Syria, was a vibrant, cosmopolitan trade hub. It was multilingual, using at least 8 different scripts, including its own unique cuneiform alphabet, a 30-letter system. It was a vital link between the Hittite interior, Egypt, and the Aegean.
Archaeological evidence at Ugarit paints a devastating picture. We have correspondence between the king of Ugarit and the king of Alashiya, Cyprus, detailing the immediate crisis. They are terrified.
In one letter, the king of Ugarit writes to the king of Alashiya, desperately asking for help. The enemy ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father be aware of this. The 7 ships of the enemy which came here inflicted much damage upon us. He was caught completely flat-footed. His defense forces were deployed elsewhere, likely fighting for the great king of Hatti, only to find his own capital under attack. The final layer of the city shows evidence of intense burning. But here's the kicker. Among the final baked tablets, there's a letter from a high official, written just before the city was destroyed, complaining about a local tax dispute. Think about that. The world is ending. Enemy ships are offshore. The capital is about to be sacked and burned forever. And the bureaucracy is still filing complaints about municipal taxes. It shows an almost unbelievable inability to recognize the scale of the impending doom until it was literally at the gates. Ugarit vanished around 1190 BCE. Its sophisticated alphabet was forgotten. The trade routes it managed dissolved. It became a ghost town, only to be rediscovered in the 20th century. What this confirms is the speed of the transition. It wasn't a slow erosion. It was a sudden,
decapitation.
One day, you are a cosmopolitan port city trading with the superpowers. The next, you are ash, and the memory of your existence is gone. This swiftness leads us back to the multi-causal theory, but with a refined focus on the timing. Everything had to hit simultaneously. The mega-drought severely weakening agricultural output across the entire Near East, the earthquakes destroying key infrastructure nodes like palaces and harbors, and the resulting famine and population displacement, the Sea Peoples, overwhelming the weakened and decentralized defense systems.
It was the perfect storm, hitting a system that had zero capacity for resilience. The sheer interconnectedness of the Bronze Age world, the very thing that made it advanced, was its fatal flaw. If the tin mines failed, the armies couldn't make weapons. If the crops failed in Greece, the Egyptian grain ships couldn't compensate due to their own localized drought. Every domino was tied to the next. The silence that followed was the sound of the world rebooting, slowly, painfully, and locally.
The Iron Age was not a glorious new chapter. It was the world picking up the pieces of a smashed civilization. And that, my friends, brings us to the fascinating legacy of this collapse. Because the Iron Age world, the world of classical Greece, the early Roman Republic, and the rise of empires like Assyria, was fundamentally different from the Bronze Age world.
The New World Order was decentralized, resilient, and far less prone to the single point of failure administration that characterized the palaces. The use of the alphabet and the reliance on iron tools fostered a degree of independence and widespread literacy that allowed ideas like philosophy, democracy, and individual rights to eventually flourish in places like Athens, something that was impossible under the rigid, centralized control of the Mycenaean Wanaks. The silent collapse killed the kings and the palaces, but it inadvertently laid the groundwork for the birth of Western philosophy and democracy. It was history's greatest, most brutal, creative destruction event. But we still have so much more to unpack. I want to dive into the specific archaeological evidence of the drought across the various sites. And we need to talk about the truly bizarre and persistent theory that the collapse was caused by something much more dramatic than just famine and war. We're talking about cosmic impacts. Yes, seriously. We need to look at the evidence for a possible meteor or comet strike that could have triggered the massive seismic activity and climate chaos. So make sure you are subscribed and that you've smashed that like button, because you definitely don't want to miss the next chapter of this epic historical mystery. Until then, keep those theories coming in the comments below. What do you think was the single biggest factor that pushed the Bronze Age over the edge? Was it the drought, the Sea Peoples, or the brittleness of the system itself? Let me know